The Politics of Women's Representation in Hip Hop is the title of this lecture. So, women MCs offer representations of female sexuality in ways that challenge attempts to police their bodies. Then they demand that we recognize their agency, and they present their own sexual and gender identities. So, we're going to look at the different messages that women put out there, the different messages that women things that women talk about, the different topics. We'll also look at motherhood and the ways in which women artists address the topic of motherhood that may differ from how male artists do. And then we'll also look at the confrontation of racism and imperialism by women hip hop artists. So in terms of looking at messages, African women artists, hip hop artists, are more likely than their male counterparts to present multidimensional representations of African women. So common themes include, discussions of both rural African women as well as urban African women. A lot of the times, the rural African woman is what is focused on, but women artists tend to focus on both rural and urban women. They focus on motherhood, they focus on aesthetics, especially kind of the pressure to look a certain way, to dress a certain way. And they also talk about mental health, depression. And so women artists are definitely more likely than male artists to kind of talk about struggles with mental illness and with depression. So an example comes from Nthabi, who was from South Africa. In her song, she says, "It's just stress, pain, problems with love. My heart breaks because it feels as though God has given up. On my mistakes, I take each day at a time and sometimes contemplate the different ways of taking my life. But suicide is not the answer to this. Whether I choose to slit my wrist or take a couple pills, I need peace." And so in that song, again, Miss Nthabi is talking about her own struggles, her own emotional struggles with depression. And again, there are several artists that deal with these topics in various ways. Other top topics specifically that women address more so than their male counterparts include gender-based violence, female genital cutting, domestic violence, and sexual harassment. So these are all topics that women tend to address more frequently than male artists, and in some cases a little bit more nuanced. You see women either placing themselves as the subject of the song or placing the subject of the song as someone who is related to them, someone who's a close friend of them, in many ways speaking in solidarity with the struggles of these women. So female hip hop artists tend to present, again, multi-dimensional depictions of women, but also motherhood. And these depictions are not limited to mothers being the bearers of tradition or the queen mother trope that is often found in hip hop music. So when we think of many of the songs written by male counterparts about motherhood, it's often, the mother playing this traditional role and kind of handing down tradition, the mother kind of being a very, a strong woman who, took on a lot of responsibilities, but doesn't really deal with the stress of that and the impact that may have on that woman's children. And so there are a couple kind of things I want to point out. The first is a quote by African feminist scholar Oyewumi Oyewumi, who has often dealt with family, women, and women's roles in her work. And so she says that the privileging of motherhood in the African family organization contrasts with the ambivalence about motherhood and feminism. So she's looking at African women and their privileging of motherhood in the African family. And so kind of to go along with that, Burni, who's a hip hop artist out of South Africa, she was one of the original members of the group Gadesa, one of the first female hip hop groups out of South Africa. In the song Femme de Combat, she says, "This story begins at the feet of our mothers, from our township streets and our gutters, who travel on taxis and trains to the suburbs, cleaning the filth that remains in the cupboards, leaving the children at the mercy of others, where little girls turning into women under covers, scrubbing the floors known as black and colored, women who work in factories where dreams are gutted." So again, this song is looking at the stress that African women and the burdens that African mothers have to undertake for their families, But unlike some of the songs that we hear from male counterparts, there's also kind of a recognition of the impact of those sacrifices and the impact on, specifically in this case, girl children, and kind of what happens to them as their mothers are at work. And there are a few artists who've dealt with the topic of motherhood. You have Kumba Sora, who is from Benin and Senegal, Tusa Sen Rap from Senegal, Nazizi from Kenya, Rapi from Tanzania, and Enigma from Botswana have all dealt with the topic of motherhood. Imperialism. So female rap artists have also been vocal about imperialism and racism. And according to African feminist scholar Filomina Chioma study, she says because of the negative and destructive effects of historical processes and racism on Africa and its people, values stressing liberation have developed as important aspects of African feminism. So in other words, African women are not only concerned about gender issues, but they also are very much invested in racial equality and battling racism and imperialism. And so this is also reflected in the music. And so the excerpt I want to read is from Gigi Lamayne, South African artist, from her song Fees Will Fall, which was a song that spoke to the Fees Must Fall movement that sought to decolonize the education system in South Africa. So in the song, she says, how long are they going to lie to us and smile with us, acting like they'll cry with us? Our parents barely get a wage, but they slave for this nation. A black child will never ever gain emancipation. I wonder if King Biko would agree to this shit. The forefathers of our land wouldn't sign to this shit. So in the song, she recalls the image and the memory of Steve Biko, who was an anti-apartheid activist who was killed in detention, but looks at kind of what our parents fought for. So she's part of the generation that was born after the fall of apartheid and kind of looks at what and questions what their parents fought for, and the fact that the post-apartheid society has kind of not lived up to their promises. In another case, the artists that are dealing with racism and imperialism are very diverse in their expressions. And so you have songs by Elnis from Kenya, Muna from Senegal, the group Godessa from South Africa, and Dope St. Jude out of South Africa. Now, because of the racial structure of society, South African artists have dealt more with racism than artists from other parts of the continent. And so one example of an artist kind of speaking out on Twitter, Kanye Mavi out of Cape Town, South Africa, wrote a tweet or tweeted a tweet that was in solidarity with the Pretoria Girls High School protest. And that was a protest that was centered around the fact that in this private school, Black girls were told that they couldn't wear their hair natural because that was seen as messy and not neat. And that part of the dress code was that their hair must be neat. And so this idea that natural hair, braids, dreadlocks, afros were not considered neat was a protest. And so you saw artists like Kanye Mavi coming out in support of what the women were going through.